the 3rd century BC, Rome was not yet the empire that would sweep across the Mediterranean. It was merely a city-state on the Italian peninsula, surrounded by countless enemies. The Samnites to the south, the Gauls to the north, the Etruscans to the west. Every neighbor eyed Rome's modest territory with covetous intent. In such an environment, the Romans had to learn how to fight. But they quickly discovered that fighting required not only courage, but also weapons, and making weapons required technology. This technology was almost completely absent in Rome at that time. The blacksmith shops outside Rome worked from dawn to dusk. The furnaces burned red hot, and the blacksmiths swung their hammers, trying to forge crude iron ore into usable weapons. But this process was filled with failure. Iron is a difficult material to master. It doesn't melt as easily as bronze, nor does it shape as easily as copper. Iron requires extremely high temperatures to soften, and if the temperature deviates even slightly, it becomes brittle or too soft. Rome's blacksmiths did not understand the chemical principles behind this. They didn't know that tiny differences in the carbon content of iron would lead to completely different results. They could only rely on experience, on trial after trial. What is worse, the quality of iron ore around Rome wasn't good. These ores were mixed with a large amount of impurities, and even after repeated smelting, the iron obtained was still full of bubbles and cracks. Such iron couldn't withstand much pressure. If a blacksmith tried to forge it into a long sword, so Roman blacksmiths could only make short swords. This wasn't their choice, but a limitation of technology. That sword would likely break in the first battle. The length of a short sword usually didn't exceed 60 centimeters. This length was just right to prevent the internal defects of the iron from becoming a fatal weakness. A short sword could stab, could slash, and could play a role in close quarters combat. But it didn't have the distance advantage of a spear, nor the slashing range of a long sword. Roman soldiers went onto the battlefield carrying these short swords. They knew their weapons weren't the best, but they had no choice. Before iron, Romans had tried bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and it had been used in the Mediterranean world for thousands of years. Greeks used bronze to make armor, Phoenicians used bronze to make ships, Egyptians used bronze to make tools. Bronze was the mainstream material of that era. The Romans also made bronze armor. These armors, usually hammered from a single bronze plate, covered the soldier's chest and back. They looked imposing and solid, gleaming with a golden luster in the sunlight. But in actual combat, bronze armor quickly exposed its weaknesses. Bronze was too soft. When an iron sword thrust toward bronze armor, the bronze would dent, deform, and could even be pierced through. The hardness of bronze was far inferior to iron. Moreover, bronze armor was extremely heavy. A complete set of bronze armor could weigh 15 to 20 kilograms. Soldiers wearing it on the march would quickly become exhausted. Worse still, the production cost of bronze was very high. Copper and tin were both scarce metals that needed to be imported from distant places. Rome was not a wealthy city-state. It couldn't equip every soldier with bronze armor, so the Romans abandoned bronze. They turned to another material, linen. Linen armor sounded like a joke. How could armor made from fabric possibly withstand attacks from swords and blades? But the Romans, as well as the Greeks before them, had all discovered the secret of linen. The process of making linen armor is extremely complex. First, craftsmen cut linen cloth into small pieces, then use glue or resin to layer these cloth pieces, one on top of another. Each layer must be pressed tightly together to ensure there are no gaps. Typically, a set of linen armor requires stacking over a dozen layers, or even dozens of layers of linen cloth. Then, the entire piece of fabric is placed on a mold and shaped into the form of a human body. Craftsmen press it down with heavy objects, allowing the glue to dry slowly. This process may take several days, or even several weeks. In the end, the linen armor becomes hard yet lightweight. Its weight is only half that of bronze armor, or even lighter, but its protective capability is surprisingly good. When a sword strikes at linen armor, the fabric fibers absorb the impact force. The sword tip might penetrate a few layers of fabric, but it is very difficult to completely pierce through. Moreover, even if the linen armor is pierced, the wound will be small, and it won't cause secondary injury to the soldier due to deformation like bronze armor does. Roman soldiers began using linen armor in large quantities. It was cheap, lightweight, and practical enough. In the early days of the Roman legions, linen armor was the most common protective equipment. The Romans were not satisfied with the status quo. They knew that their weapons and armor were not the best. They had heard that in the distant east, there was a material called steel. It was a metal harder and sharper than iron. The craftsmen of the East mastered some mysterious technique that could repeatedly forge, fold, and quench iron, ultimately creating an almost perfect material. But this technique was beyond the reach of the Romans. Roman blacksmiths had tried to imitate the Eastern technique. They repeatedly heated and forged iron blocks, attempting to make them harder. But they didn't know that the key lay in the carbon content. The carbon content in iron had to be controlled within a very precise range to form steel. Too little, and the iron would be too soft; too much, and the iron would become brittle. The Romans had no way to precisely control the carbon content. They had no thermometers, no chemical analysis tools, and didn't even know what carbon was. They could only rely on experience, on luck. Most of the time they failed, so the Romans could only continue using short swords. They could only continue using linen armor. They could only seek other ways out within the shackles of technology. In 390 BC, the Romans encountered a disaster. That year the Gauls moved south, crossed the Alps, and entered the Italian peninsula. They were a group of fierce warriors, wielding long swords, tall in stature, letting out deafening roars in battle. The Romans had never seen such enemies before. The Roman army engaged the Gauls in battle at the Allia River. The Roman soldiers formed tight phalanxes, holding short swords and shields, trying to resist the Gallic charge. But the Gallic long swords, over a meter in length, could cut through the Roman soldiers' shields and split open their helmets before they could even get close. The Roman army was routed. The Gauls pursued them all the way to the gates of Rome. They breached the walls, rushed into the streets, burned down houses, and slaughtered residents. Rome fell into a sea of flames. This war left the Romans with a profound lesson. They realized that relying solely on short swords was not enough. They needed better tactics, stricter training, and more flexible combat methods. But they also realized that the length of weapons was not the only factor determining victory or defeat in war. Although the Gauls had long swords, they lacked discipline, lacked organization, lacked the ability to sustain prolonged combat. After breaking into Rome, they soon had to retreat due to internal divisions and supply shortages. The Romans began to think about a question: how to create infinite possibilities with limited weapons. The Romans eventually found the answer. The answer was not in the weapon itself, but in the way the weapon was used. The short sword, although it didn't have the distance advantage of a spear, had an advantage that spears didn't have: flexibility. The short sword could stab, could slash, could be used in narrow spaces, and could quickly switch attack directions on a chaotic battlefield. The Romans began training soldiers, teaching them how to leverage the advantages of the short sword in close quarters combat. They no longer formed tight phalanxes like the Greeks, but instead spread out, leaving each soldier enough space to freely wield their weapons. They also equipped the short sword with a shield. This shield was not an ordinary shield. It was a large rectangular shield, over a meter in height, and nearly half a meter in width. It could cover most of a soldier's body, providing powerful protection. Moreover, the edges of this shield were reinforced with metal and could be used to ram enemies or even to parry enemy weapons. The combination of short sword and shield became the symbol of the Roman legions. This combination compensated for the short sword's weaknesses while bringing out its advantages. Roman soldiers could use the shield to block enemy attacks. Then, in the instant, the enemy showed an opening, stab at their vital points with the short sword. This tactic requires extremely high skill and courage. Soldiers must remain calm in close combat, accurately judge the timing, and react quickly. But once this tactic is mastered, Roman soldiers become extremely deadly. Hundreds of years later, when the territory of the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara Desert, people had forgotten how crude the original weapons of the Roman legions were. They forgot that the Roman short sword was due to technical limitations, not tactical choice. They forgot that Roman linen armor was due to poverty, not wisdom, but iron remembers. Every Roman short sword records the limitations of that era. Every piece of linen armor witnesses the struggles of that time. The shackles of technology did not stop the Romans from advancing. On the contrary, it forced the Romans to seek other paths, and this path ultimately led to the glory of the empire. In the summer of 2016 BC, on the plains of Cannae, a Roman soldier was dying. His name was Gaius, 23 years old, from a small village in Latium. His father was a farmer. His mother died when he was 10. He should have spent his life in the fields, growing wheat, raising children, and then dying peacefully in his own bed on some quiet night. But war changed everything. At this moment, he lay in a pool of blood, his abdomen pierced through by a Carthaginian cavalryman's spear. His short sword was still gripped in his hand, but he no longer had the strength to wield it. His vision began to blur. He heard the shouts of battle around him, heard the screams of his comrades, heard the cheers of the enemy. Then everything fell silent. Gaius's short sword fell to the ground. The blade was covered in blood and dirt. This sword, less than 60 centimeters in length, weighing less than a kilogram. It looked so ordinary, so unremarkable. But this sword, along with thousands upon thousands of short swords just like it, had once conquered the entire Mediterranean world. The Roman short sword was not invented by the Romans. It came from the Iberian Peninsula, from those tribes the Romans called Spaniards. These tribes lived in rugged mountain regions, and their warriors were known for their ferocity and cunning. They used a distinctive sword, short and wide-bladed, with a sharp point, capable of both thrusting and slashing. In the 3rd century BC, the Roman army first encountered these Spanish warriors during their war with Carthage. They were hired as mercenaries for Carthage and displayed astonishing combat effectiveness on the battlefield. Roman soldiers discovered that these Spaniards' short swords were more effective than Rome's traditional long swords in close quarters melee combat. The Romans had always been good at learning. They studied the design of the Spanish short sword and then made improvements. They adjusted the length of the blade to better suit the height and arm span of Roman soldiers. They improved the design of the hilt to make it easier to grip. They also added a central ridge to the blade, making it sturdier and less prone to bending. Eventually, the Roman short sword was born. This sword was called the gladius. Its length was typically between 45 and 60 centimeters. Its weight was approximately between 700 and 1,000 grams. Its blade was leaf-shaped with a sharp point and sharp edges. It wasn't the longest sword, nor was it the heaviest sword, but it was the most suitable sword for the Romans. The Roman legions didn't fight on open plains. They fought in valleys, in forests, in city streets. The terrain they faced was often rugged, narrow, and full of obstacles. In such environments, long swords were a burden. The Greek spears, reaching 5 to 6 meters in length, required open space to be effective. Once entering narrow valleys or dense forests, the spears would become cumbersome and useless. Soldiers couldn't wield their spears, couldn't maintain formation, couldn't effectively attack the enemy. But short swords were different. The length of the short sword allows it to be used in any space. In narrow valleys, Roman soldiers could thrust their short swords at enemies. In dense forests, Roman soldiers could use their short swords to cut through branches and clear paths. On city streets, Roman soldiers could use their short swords in close quarters combat to quickly kill enemies. The short sword is an adaptive weapon. It doesn't pursue distance, doesn't pursue power, doesn't pursue fancy techniques. What it pursues is efficiency, to kill the enemy in the shortest time. With the smallest movements, Roman soldiers were trained to become the embodiment of this efficiency. In the training camps of the Roman legions, the first thing recruits learned was distance, not long distance, but close distance. The distance where you can hear the enemy's breathing, the distance where you can see the fear in the enemy's eyes, the distance where you can smell the sweat on the enemy's body. The drill instructor would have the recruits pair up and stand face to face. The distance between them was less than a meter. Then, the drill instructor would have them simulate thrusting attacks with wooden swords. Look at his eyes. The drill instructor said, "Don't look at his sword, don't look at his shield. Look at his eyes. When his eyes flicker, when his breathing changes, that is the moment he is about to attack." The recruits would initially feel uncomfortable. This distance was too close enough to feel oppressive, to feel fear. But the drill instructor wouldn't let them back down. "On the battlefield, you'll be closer," the training officer said. "You'll feel the enemy's blood splashing on your faces. You'll feel the enemy's bodies falling at your feet. If you are afraid now, then on the battlefield you'll die." The recruits, gritting their teeth, continued training. They learned how to stay calm in close quarters combat. They learned how to use shields to block enemy attacks. They learned how to use short swords to stab at the enemy's vital points. They learned how to kill a person within breathing distance. The Roman short sword was primarily used for thrusting, not slashing. This was a deliberate choice. Slashing requires more space. A soldier must swing his arm, letting the blade arc through the air to strike the enemy. This motion takes time, requires space, and is easily blocked by the enemy's shield. But thrusting is different. Thrusting is a linear motion. A soldier only needs to push the sword forward, and the tip will pierce into the enemy's body. This motion is fast, precise and very difficult to defend against. Moreover, wounds caused by thrusting are often fatal. When the sword tip pierces into the enemy's abdomen, it penetrates the internal organs, causing massive internal bleeding. The enemy may not die immediately, but he'll lose his ability to fight. He'll fall to the ground, struggling in pain, then slowly die. Roman soldiers were trained to be experts in thrusting. They don't pursue fancy swordsmanship, don't pursue complex moves. They only pursue one thing, thrusting the sword tip into the enemy's body. In the training camp, there is a wooden humanoid target. On the target's abdomen, a red circle is marked. The recruits must practice repeatedly, thrusting the sword tip into this circle. At first, their thrusts will miss the target. The sword tip will hit the target's chest, or shoulder, or thigh, but the training officer won't be satisfied. Again, the training officer says, "Hit the abdomen, only the abdomen." The recruits practice again and again. Their arms start to ache, their shoulders start to stiffen, but they can't stop, because on the battlefield, they only have one chance. If they thrust off target, the enemy will counterattack. If they don't thrust deep enough, the enemy will keep fighting. If they hesitate, the enemy will kill them. So they must practice until thrusting becomes instinct, until they don't need to think, and can accurately thrust the sword tip into the enemy's abdomen. The short sword is never used alone. It is always together with the shield, forming a complete combat system. The shield of Roman soldiers is a large rectangular shield called scutum. Its height exceeds 1 meter, and its width is close to half a meter. It is made of wooden boards, covered with leather or cloth on the outside, and reinforced with metal at the edges. In the center of the shield, there is a metal protrusion called the boss, which can be used to strike enemies. This shield is not just a defensive tool. It is a weapon, it is cover, it is the second life of a Roman soldier. In battle, Roman soldiers would hold the shield in front of them, covering most of their body. They would observe the enemy's movements through the edge of the shield. When the enemy attacks, they would block the attack with the shield. When the enemy shows an opening, they would stab at the enemy with their short sword. The coordination of shield and short sword is like a dance. Shield advances, short sword thrusts out. Shield retreats, short sword pulls back. Shield moves left, short sword follows. Shield moves right, short sword follows. This kind of coordination requires extremely high coordination. Soldiers must control both shield and short sword simultaneously, must react in an instant, must maintain a clear mind on the chaotic battlefield. In the training camp, recruits would engage in countless sparring sessions. They would simulate various combat scenarios, would practice various offensive and defensive combinations, would continue fighting under fatigue and pressure, because only in this way can they survive on a real battlefield. 168 BC, the Battle of Pydne, the Roman legions facing the Macedonian phalanx. The Macedonian phalanx was the pinnacle of Greek military tradition. Soldiers wielding spears up to 5 meters long formed tight formations, creating an insurmountable barrier. Their spears protruded through gaps in the shields, forming a forest of deadly spikes. The Roman soldiers looking at this barrier felt the pressure, but they didn't back down. When the battle began, the Roman soldiers tried to charge the Macedonian phalanx head-on, but they quickly discovered this was impossible. The Macedonian soldiers' spears pierced them before they could even get close. The Roman commander changed tactics. He ordered his soldiers not to charge head-on, but to look for weaknesses in the phalanx. The Macedonian phalanx, though powerful, had one fatal weakness: it couldn't adapt to terrain. The battlefield of Pydna wasn't completely flat. On the ground there were small hills, ditches, and rocks. As the Macedonian phalanx advanced, its formation began to lose cohesion. Some soldiers moved a bit faster, some soldiers moved a bit slower. Gaps appeared in the phalanx. The Roman soldiers saw these gaps. They charged in. They no longer tried to confront the spears head-on, but instead slipped through the gaps, entering the interior of the phalanx. Once inside, the Macedonian soldiers' spears became useless. They couldn't use their spears at close range, couldn't turn to face attacks coming from the sides and rear. The Roman soldiers with their short swords began the slaughter. They stabbed at the Macedonian soldiers' bellies, stabbed at their backs, stabbed at their thighs. The Macedonian soldiers tried to resist, but their spears were utterly useless in close combat. They could only discard their spears and draw their short swords, but it was too late. The Roman soldiers had already gained the advantage. The Macedonian phalanx began to collapse. Soldiers discarded their weapons and started to flee. The Roman soldiers pursued them, cutting them down all the way. The Battle of Pydna ended in Roman victory. This battle proved the advantage of the short sword. It wasn't the longest weapon, wasn't the heaviest weapon, but it was the most flexible weapon. It could be used on any terrain, could be effective in any situation. And the Macedonian spear, though invincible on flat terrain, became a burden once the terrain changed. But flexibility comes at a price. The effectiveness of the short sword depended entirely on the soldier wielding it. An inadequately trained soldier, holding a short sword on the battlefield, is nothing but a lamb waiting to be slaughtered. He cannot remain calm in close combat. He cannot accurately stab at the enemy's vital points. He cannot coordinate the movements of his shield and short sword. Therefore, Roman soldiers must undergo rigorous training. They must practice thrusting daily, practice defense, practice formation changes. They must build physical strength through weighted marches. They must train their mental fortitude through simulated combat. They must become warriors among warriors. Because only in this way can the short sword unleash its power. Because only in this way can the Roman legions be invincible on the battlefield. Gaius, that soldier who died on the plains of Cannae, had once received such training. He once sweated in the training camp. He once thrust at wooden targets again and again during sparring. He once carried heavy equipment through long marches on endless roads. He became a qualified Roman soldier, but even the most qualified soldier cannot guarantee survival on the battlefield. War never lets only the weak die. War devours everyone. Gaius's short sword lies in the soil of the Cannae plains. It witnessed Rome's glory, and it witnessed Rome's defeat. It is an ordinary sword, but it carries the dreams of an empire. But flexibility comes at a cost. Every Roman soldier must become a warrior among warriors. In the darkness before dawn, the camp awakened. No trumpets, no shouting, only low, rhythmic sounds. The sound of leather boots treading on earth, the sound of armor clashing against each other, the sound of soldiers conversing in low voices. This was the breathing of the Roman legion, 107 BC, a military camp somewhere in North Africa. Consul Marius was conducting a revolution, not a political revolution, but a military revolution. He wanted to change the very nature of the Roman legion, to transform it from a citizen army into a professional army. Before Marius, Roman soldiers were all temporarily conscripted. They were farmers, merchants, craftsmen. When war came, they put down their hoes and took up weapons. When war ended, they returned to their hometowns and continued their lives. But this system had a fatal flaw. The soldiers' training was insufficient. They didn't have enough time to master complex tactics. They didn't have enough experience to handle unexpected situations. They didn't have enough discipline to maintain formation on a chaotic battlefield. Marius decided to change all of this. He began recruiting those poor people without land, those willing to make the military their profession. He provided them with equipment, provided them with wages, provided them with land after retirement. In exchange, these soldiers had to undergo rigorous training, had to dedicate their lives to the legion. Training began with marching. Every morning at dawn, the soldiers must conduct marches with full gear. They carry their complete equipment, armor, shields, short swords, javelins, rations, tools, and part of a tent. The total weight of this equipment exceeds 30 kilograms. They must march 32 kilometers with this load. 32 kilometers is approximately 20 Roman miles. This is the standard marching distance for a Roman legion. The soldiers must complete this distance within 5 hours. The recruits think this is impossible. Their shoulders ache from the weight of the equipment. Their feet blister inside their leather boots. Their breathing becomes rapid and labored. They want to stop, want to rest, want to give up, but the training officer won't let them stop. Keep moving, the training officer shouts. On the battlefield, the enemy won't wait for you to rest. On the battlefield, if you stop, you die. The soldiers grit their teeth and press on. Their steps are chaotic at first. Some walk fast, some walk slow. Some breathe rapidly, some breathe steadily. But as time passes, their steps begin to fall into sync. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. One rhythm, one breath. This isn't by chance. This is the result of training. The Roman legion does not pursue individual strength, but collective strength. A soldier, no matter how strong, no matter how brave, is fragile on the battlefield. But a group of soldiers, if they can coordinate as one, if they can act as a single entity, then they are invincible. Marching is the first step in training this coordination. When the soldiers' footsteps are in sync, their breathing will also be in sync. When their breathing is in sync, their heartbeats will also be in sync. They are no longer a group of individuals, but an organic whole. They become a legion. After the march ends, the soldiers will not rest. They must immediately begin building the camp. The Roman legion, wherever it goes, will build a camp. Even if staying for just one night, they will build a complete, heavily defended camp. This is not a waste of time. This is a necessity for survival. The construction of the camp follows strict standards. First, the soldiers will use measuring tools to mark out the boundaries of the camp. The shape of the camp is usually square or rectangular, with side lengths determined by the number of people in the legion. Then, the soldiers will begin digging trenches. The depth of the trenches is usually 1 meter to 1.5 meters. The excavated soil will be piled on the inner side of the trench, forming an earthen wall. On top of the earthen wall, sharpened wooden stakes will be inserted, forming a palisade. This defensive fortification, though crude, is very effective. If the enemy wants to attack the camp, they must first cross the trench, then climb the earthen wall, and finally break through the palisade. This gives the soldiers inside the camp time to react. The interior of the camp also has a strict layout. The commander's tent is in the center, surrounded by the officers' tents, with the common soldiers' tents on the outer perimeter. The position of each tent is fixed. Even in darkness, soldiers can accurately find their own positions. Building a camp usually takes 2 to 3 hours. After marching 32 kilometers, the soldiers still have to dig trenches, carry wooden stakes, and set up tents. Their bodies are exhausted to the limit, but this is the purpose of training. On the battlefield, soldiers won't always be full of energy. They'll be tired, hungry, and injured. But even in such circumstances, they must continue fighting, must continue executing orders. So, training must be harsher than the battlefield. Only this way can soldiers maintain composure and efficiency on the real battlefield. After the camp is built, soldiers will conduct formation drills. This is the most important part of training. The combat effectiveness of the Roman legion doesn't lie in individual bravery, but in collective coordination. A Roman soldier facing a Gallic warrior alone might lose. But 100 Roman soldiers facing 100 Gallic warriors will almost always win, because Roman soldiers knew how to fight as a whole. Formation drills started with the most basic formations. The soldiers lined up in 3 horizontal rows. The first row was the young soldiers, the second row was the prime soldiers, and the third row was the reserve soldiers. A certain distance was maintained between each row. Each soldier had their own fixed position. The drill instructor would issue various commands. Advance, the soldiers stepped forward in unison. Their footsteps were completely synchronized. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. Their shields formed a moving wall in front of them. Halt! The soldiers stopped immediately. No one took an extra step. No one took fewer steps. Right turn. The soldiers turned right in unison. The entire formation, like a giant machine, changed direction precisely. Throw javelins. The soldiers raised their javelins and threw them with force. Hundreds of javelins flew into the air simultaneously, then landed in the designated area. Draw swords. The soldiers put down their javelins and drew their short swords. The blades glinted coldly in the sunlight. Charge. The soldiers let out low roars and charged forward. They didn't run in disarray, but maintained their formation, like a torrent of steel, crushing all obstacles. These movements the soldiers would practice repeatedly, once, twice, 10 times, 100 times, until these movements became instinct, until they didn't need to think and could make the correct response. Because on the battlefield, there is no time to think. On the battlefield, hesitating for even a second could mean death. In formation drills, the most important thing is the coordination of shields. The shields of Roman soldiers are not merely personal defensive tools. When soldiers stand together, their shields overlap with each other, forming a continuous barrier. This barrier is called the testudo. In the testudo formation, soldiers in the front row hold their shields in front of them. Soldiers on the sides hold their shields at their sides. Soldiers in the back row hold their shields above their heads. The entire formation is completely covered by shields, like a giant turtle. This formation can effectively resist arrows and thrown weapons. Enemy arrows will hit the shields, making dull impact sounds. But the arrows cannot penetrate the shields, cannot harm the soldiers behind them. Forming the testudo requires extremely high coordination. Soldiers must precisely control the position of their shields, must ensure there are no gaps between the shields. If one soldier's shield is in the wrong position, the entire formation will have a weak point. In the training camp, Soldiers repeatedly practice forming the testudo. The training officer will have other soldiers throw wooden javelins at the testudo. The javelins will fall like raindrops, striking the shields and making dense sounds. Soldiers under the shields must remain calm. They must endure the shock of impacts, must endure the interference of noise, must keep the shield's positions unchanged. If anyone's shield moves, the drill instructor will point it out immediately. Your shield is off. If this were a real battlefield, your comrade would be dead. The soldier will immediately adjust the shield's position. Then the training continues. Javelins keep falling, shields keep clashing. The soldiers' arms begin to ache. Their shoulders begin to tremble, but they cannot lower their shields, because on the battlefield, lowering your shield means death. The Greek phalanx pursues static power. Greek soldiers stand in tight formation, holding long spears like a wall, waiting for the enemy's charge. They don't need to move, don't need to change formation. They only need to stand there and thrust their spears at any approaching enemy. This tactic is very effective on flat terrain, but it has a fatal weakness: lack of flexibility. Once the terrain changes, once the enemy attacks from the flanks or rear, the Greek phalanx falls into trouble, because the soldiers cannot turn quickly, cannot move quickly, cannot adapt to sudden situations. The Roman legion pursues dynamic power. Roman soldiers won't stand in place waiting. They will move, will change formation, will make flexible responses according to battlefield conditions. Their formation is not rigid, but fluid. When enemies attack from the front, Roman soldiers would form a horizontal line, using shields and short swords to resist the attack. When enemies attack from the side, Roman soldiers would quickly turn, transforming the flank into the front. When enemies attack from the rear, Roman soldiers would split into two parts, one part continuing to face the enemies in front, the other part turning to face the enemies behind. This flexibility was gained through countless training sessions. Soldiers had to be familiar with various formation changes, had to be able to switch from one formation to another in an instant, had to be able to keep a clear head on the chaotic battlefield and make correct judgments in the training camp. The drill instructor would simulate various battlefield situations. Enemies attacking from the left. Soldiers would immediately turn left and adjust formation. Enemies attacking from the rear. Soldiers, some would turn around, some would stay in position. Enemies are fleeing, pursue. Soldiers would maintain formation and advance forward. Every change had to be swift and precise. Every change had to maintain the integrity of the formation, because on the battlefield, the collapse of formation meant the collapse of the legion. Training was brutal. Soldiers had to march long distances every day, had to build camps every day, had to drill formations every day. Their bodies endured tremendous pressure. Their muscles would tear during training, then heal during rest, becoming even stronger. But not everyone could persevere. Some recruits will fall during the march. Their bodies cannot bear the 30-kilogram load, cannot bear the 32-kilometer distance. They will be sent home, or assigned to logistics units. Some recruits will get injured during training. Their feet will blister and bleed. Their shoulders will be bruised by equipment. Their hands will be cut by tools while digging trenches. But most recruits will persevere. They will endure the pain, endure the exhaustion, endure the drill instructor's scolding. They will, in sweat, slowly become soldiers. Their bodies become strong. Their movements become precise. Their will becomes firm. They learned how to fight as part of a legion, not as individuals. They learned how to maintain order in chaos. They learned how to maintain courage in fear. 58 BC, Gaul. Caesar's legions are fighting against Germanic tribes. The Germanic warriors, tall and fierce, wield massive battle axes and let out deafening roars. The Roman soldiers looking at these giant-like enemies felt fear, but they did not flee because they were not fighting alone. They stood beside their comrades, feeling their comrades' breath, hearing their comrades' heartbeats. They knew that as long as they maintained formation, as long as they covered each other, they would not be defeated. At the start of the battle, Germanic warriors charged toward the Roman lines. Their battle axes swung through the air, accompanied by the howling sound of wind. Roman soldiers raised their shields. The battle axes struck the shields, producing dull impact sounds. The shields were hacked with deep dents, but the shields did not break. Roman soldiers behind their shields drew their short swords. When Germanic warriors swung their battle axes, their bodies would expose openings. Roman soldiers seized these openings and thrust their short swords toward the Germanic warriors' abdomens. Germanic warriors fell one after another. Their strength, their ferocity, were useless in the face of the Roman legion's discipline. Because the Roman legion was not a collection of individuals. The Roman legion was an organic whole. It had its own breathing, its own pulse, its own will. It was the result of countless training sessions, the condensation of countless drops of sweat, the sacrifice of countless soldiers. It was the backbone of the Roman Empire. But even the mightiest legion would encounter terrain it could not overcome. 216 BC, a certain morning in August, on the plains of Cannae, the morning mist had not yet dispersed. The Aufidus River flowed quietly, its waters glimmering with faint silver light in the morning sun. Roman consul Varro stood at the front of the legion, looking at the Carthaginian army across from him. He believed that today would be Rome's day of victory. He had 86,000 soldiers, the largest legion in Roman history. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and high in morale, and Hannibal on the opposite side had only 50,000 men. In numbers, Rome held an absolute advantage. But Varro overlooked one thing. He overlooked the terrain. The plain of Cannae appeared to be an open flatland, very suitable for large-scale legion warfare. But this plain was not completely flat. On one side was the Aufidus River, on the other side were gently rising hills, and Varro deployed his legions in the narrow strip between the river and the hills. He wanted to use his numerical advantage, with a dense formation, to crush Hannibal's army in one stroke. But he didn't realize that this decision would lead to the most devastating defeat in Roman history. When the battle began, the Roman legions advanced forward. 86,000 soldiers, arranged in tight formation, like a torrent of steel, surged toward the Carthaginian army. Their footsteps shook the earth. Their armor glinted coldly in the sunlight. Hannibal stood at the rear of his army, observing calmly. He saw the Roman legion's formation, saw them compressed in the narrow strip, saw their flanks almost pressed against the river and hills. He smiled. Hannibal's army was arranged in an arc formation. The center consisted of Gallic and Spanish infantry, the flanks were African heavy infantry, and the outermost sides were Numidian cavalry. When the Roman legions charged toward the Carthaginian center, the Gallic and Spanish infantry began to retreat. They weren't fleeing in disarray, but retreating according to plan. The Roman soldiers, thinking the enemy was collapsing, pushed forward even more fiercely. They crowded together, trying to break through the Carthaginian center, but they didn't notice that the Carthaginian flanks were closing inward. The African heavy infantry surrounded the Roman legions from both sides. The Numidian cavalry circled around to the rear of the Roman legions. The Roman legions were surrounded. They were compressed into an increasingly smaller space. They couldn't deploy their formations, couldn't leverage their numerical advantage. They were packed together like sardines, unable to move. On one side was the river, on the other side were hills, in front were enemies, and behind were also enemies. The Roman soldiers began to panic. They tried to turn around, tried to break out, but they were blocked by their own comrades. They raised their shields, but the shields were crushed and deformed. They swung their short swords, but the swords couldn't be effective in such a narrow space. Carthaginian soldiers thrust at the Roman legions from all directions. Roman soldiers fell one after another. Their blood flowed into the Aufidus River, turning the water red. By evening, the battle was over. Of the 86,000 Roman soldiers, fewer than 10,000 escaped. The rest either died in battle or were captured. The Battle of Cannae became the most devastating defeat in Roman history, and the root of this defeat was not the cowardice of the soldiers, not the inferiority of their weapons, but the terrain. Varro deployed his legions on terrain where they couldn't leverage their advantages. He let the river and hills become a cage for the Roman legions. The terrain became Rome's curse. On 905 BC, Erosio, the Roman legions once again faced the test of terrain. This time their enemies were the Germanic Cimbri and Teutones. These northern barbarians, tall and fierce, surged toward Rome's borders like a tide. Rome dispatched 2 legions, commanded by Consul Malleus Maximus and Consul Servilius Scipio, but these 2 consuls were at odds with each other. They refused to cooperate, each fighting their own battle. Scipio deployed his legion on a hillside by the Henny River. He believed that occupying high ground meant having the advantage. Attacking downward from above, soldiers could use gravity to increase the force of their attacks, and when enemies attacked upward, they would expend more energy. This idea was correct in theory, but Scipio overlooked one problem: the steepness of the slope. The slopes of Erosio were not gentle inclines, but steep slopes. The soldiers standing on the slopes had to exert force to maintain their balance. Their feet easily slipped on the loose soil. When the Germanic people launched their attack, the Roman soldiers tried to maintain formation, but the steepness of the slope made the formation unstable. The soldiers in the front row, due to gravity, involuntarily leaned forward. Their shields couldn't maintain a vertical position. Their short swords couldn't accurately stab at the enemy. The soldiers in the back row tried to support the front row, but they themselves couldn't stand steady either. The entire formation began to sway. The Germanic people saw this opening. They let out deafening roars and charged toward the Roman line. The Roman soldiers tried to resist, but their feet slipped, and they lost their balance completely. The soldiers in the front row fell to the ground. The soldiers in the back row were tripped by those in front. The Roman line, like dominoes, began to collapse. The Germanic people rushed into the Roman line and began the slaughter. The Roman soldiers tried to flee, but the steepness of the slope made escape difficult. They stumbled on the slope, some fell, some rolled down the hillside. The Germanic people pursued them, hacking and slashing all the way. The Battle of Drowsy ended in a crushing defeat for Rome. 2 legions almost completely annihilated. 80,000 Roman soldiers killed in battle or captured. This defeat shocked all of Rome. People began to question whether the Roman legions were truly invincible, and the root of this defeat, once again, was terrain. Capio chose what seemed like an advantageous high ground, but he didn't consider the steepness of the slope. He let the terrain become the enemy of the Roman legions. 9 Ad Teutoburg Forest. Roman governor Varus led 3 legions through the forests of Germania. This was a routine march, returning from summer camp to winter camp. Varus didn't anticipate any danger. He believed the Germanic tribes had been conquered by Rome and would no longer resist. But he was wrong. Germanic chieftain Arminius, who had once served in the Roman army and was familiar with Roman tactics, secretly organized an army, preparing to ambush the Roman legions in the forest. The ambush location Arminius chose was the most treacherous section of Teutoburg Forest. The terrain here was extremely complex. The forest was dense, the trees tall, sunlight barely able to penetrate the canopy. The ground was covered with thick layers of fallen leaves and moss, and the most deadly thing was the mud. A few days ago there was a heavy rain here. The rainwater seeped into the ground, turning the soil into a swamp. The soldiers walked on it, sinking into the mud with every step, needing to pull their feet out with force each time. The Roman legions lost all their advantages in this kind of terrain. They couldn't maintain formation. The soldiers were forced to stretch out their ranks, advancing in single file on the narrow forest paths. They couldn't use their shields. Trees and bushes blocked the movement of the shields. The soldiers had to hold their shields in front of them, but this way their vision was obstructed. They couldn't use their short swords. In such a narrow space, the short swords were useless, and the Germanic people were familiar with this forest. They hid behind trees, hid in the bushes, waiting for the Roman legions to enter the ambush circle. When the Roman legions entered the deepest part of the forest, the Germanic people launched their attack. From all directions, they hurled javelins at the Roman legions. The javelins passed through the gaps between trees, shooting toward the Roman soldiers. The Roman soldiers tried to raise their shields, but the shields were blocked by trees. The javelins struck their bodies. They tried to fight back, but they couldn't see the enemy. The Germanic people shot javelins from behind trees, then immediately hid. The Roman soldiers struggled in the mud. They tried to maintain formation, but the mud made it impossible for them to move. Their feet, deeply sunk into the soil, required tremendous effort with every step. They tried to charge at the enemy, but the density of the forest made it impossible for them to locate the enemy's position. They tried to flee, but the mud made escape impossible. The Germanic tribes, like hunters, slowly wore down the Roman legions. They didn't need direct confrontation, only to keep throwing javelins, keep harassing, keep weakening the Roman legion's strength. The battle lasted 3 days. For 3 days, the Roman legions slowly died in the forest. Soldiers fell in the mud. Their blood seeped into the soil. Their bodies were covered by fallen leaves. By the 3rd day, the Roman legions were almost completely annihilated. Varus, in despair, drew his sword and committed suicide. 3 legions, 20,000 soldiers, vanished in the Teutoburg forest. This defeat shocked the entire Roman Empire. Emperor Augustus, upon hearing the news, cried out in anguish, "Varus, give me back my legions." The defeat at Teutoburg Forest made Rome realize that their legions were not invincible on all terrains. In forests, in mud, in complex terrain, the Roman legion's advantages would be completely negated. Terrain once again became Rome's curse. 53 BC, Carrhae. Crassus, one of the three giants of Rome, led 7 legions to invade the Parthian Empire. Crassus was the richest man in Rome. He craved military glory, yearning to become a hero of Rome like Pompey and Caesar. He believed that conquering Parthia would bring him endless wealth and glory, but he underestimated the Parthians, and he underestimated the terrain. Parthia was located on the Mesopotamian plain. The terrain here was completely different from the Mediterranean region Rome was familiar with. There were no forests, no mountains, only endless desert and plains. The summers here were hot and dry. The sun hung in the sky like a fireball. The ground was scorching hot. The air was so dry it was suffocating. Crassus's legions began their march in such an environment. They wore heavy armor, carried their equipment, and advanced under the blazing sun. Sweat flowed from their bodies, soaking their clothes. Their lips cracked and bled. Their throats were parched like they were on fire. They needed water, but here there were no rivers. Crassus sent out scouts to search for water sources. The scouts found a river, a tributary of the Euphrates, but this river was still a long distance from the legion's position. Crassus decided to press on, hoping to reach the river as soon as possible, but the Parthians wouldn't give him that chance. The Parthian army was composed of cavalry. They rode swift horses and carried powerful composite bows. They didn't need to confront the Roman legions head-on, only to shoot arrows continuously from a distance. Parthian cavalry appeared around the Roman legions. They kept their distance, beyond the range of Roman soldiers, shooting arrows at the Roman legions. Arrows fell like raindrops. Roman soldiers raised their shields, trying to block them, but there were too many arrows, too dense. Some arrows passed through gaps in the shields, hitting soldiers' bodies. Some arrows hit soldiers' legs, making them fall to the ground. Roman soldiers tried to charge toward the Parthian cavalry, but the cavalry immediately retreated. Their horses were much faster than the Roman soldiers. The Roman soldiers couldn't catch up with them. Then the cavalry would appear again and shoot arrows again. This tactic was called the Parthian shot. It exploited the cavalry's mobility, exploited the composite bow's range, leaving the Roman legions unable to fight back. Roman soldiers under the scorching sun, in the rain of arrows, slowly died. They craved water, craved shade, craved rest, but they couldn't get any. Parthian cavalry constantly harassed them, constantly shot arrows, constantly wore down their strength. Crassus tried to organize a counterattack, but his legions were already exhausted. The soldiers under the scorching sun lost their will to fight. They only wanted to flee, only wanted to survive. In the end, the Roman legions near Carrhae were surrounded by the Parthian army. Crassus attempted to negotiate, but the Parthians killed him. 7 legions, 40,000 soldiers, most died in battle or were captured. Only a few escaped back to Rome. The Battle of Carrhae became another painful defeat in Roman history. And the root of this defeat, once again, was terrain. Crassus led his legions into a terrain unsuitable for Roman tactics. In the desert, on plains without water sources, the advantages of the Roman legions were completely negated. Terrain became an insurmountable obstacle for Rome, but the Romans did not always fail. They learned from defeat, learned from terrain. After the Battle of Cannae, Rome changed its tactics. They no longer pursued numerical superiority, but pursued flexibility. They learned how to adjust formations, adjust tactics, on different terrains. After the Battle of Arausio, Marius carried out military reforms. He improved training methods, improved equipment, making the Roman legions more adaptable to complex terrain. After the defeat at the Teutoburg Forest, Rome abandoned its plan to conquer Germania. They realized that forests and swamps were unsuitable for Roman legion warfare. They fixed the border at the Rhine River, no longer expanding eastward. After the Battle of Carrhae, Rome learned how to counter cavalry. They increased their own cavalry forces. They improved their defensive tactics. They learned how to protect themselves on open plains. The Romans gained an advantage by adapting to the terrain. They no longer tried to use the same tactics on all terrains. They learned to adjust their tactics according to the characteristics of the terrain. In the mountains, they used light infantry, taking advantage of the terrain's cover to conduct guerrilla warfare. In the forests, they cleared roads, built camps, and ensured the safety of supply lines. In the desert, they carried sufficient water supplies and avoided marching for long periods under the scorching sun. On the plains, they strengthened their cavalry to ensure the safety of their flanks. The Roman legions became more flexible, more adaptable, but this adaptation came at a cost. It required more training, more experience, more wisdom. It required commanders who could see through the traps of terrain, who could anticipate enemy tactics, who could make the right decisions in chaos. It required one man, a man who could see through the chaos, a man who could turn terrain from a curse into an advantage. 61 BC, summer, Rome, early morning. A man stood at the door of his own house, looking at the creditors at the end of the street. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. He was 39 years old. He was a Roman nobleman with an ancient surname and an illustrious family background. But at this moment, the debts he owed were enough to bankrupt him. 750 talents. This was an astronomical figure, equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. He borrowed money to run for public office. He borrowed money to host gladiator games and please the people. He borrowed money to secure a place on Rome's political stage. But now the creditors had come. They stood at the street corner waiting for him. Their eyes were cold and resolute. If he couldn't repay, he would lose everything: his property, his dignity, his political career. Caesar took a deep breath. He had no money, but he had one thing: he had ambition. He turned and walked inside. He wrote a letter and sent it to Crassus, the richest man in Rome. In the letter, he proposed a deal. If Crassus was willing to guarantee his debts, he would become Crassus's ally in politics. Crassus agreed, because Crassus saw a certain quality in Caesar: a reckless determination, a madness willing to trade everything for power. Caesar was saved, but from that moment on he knew he had to win. He had to keep climbing upward until he stood at the highest point in Rome, because if he stopped, if he failed, what he would lose wouldn't just be money, but his entire life. 68 BC, Spain. A small city called Gades. Caesar sent here to serve as quaestor, an insignificant position on the edge of the empire far from Rome's center of power. His daily work was reviewing accounts, handling taxes, resolving local disputes. It was tedious work, but one day he entered the city's temple. In the temple stood a statue. It was a statue of Alexander the Great. The statue was tall, imposing, as if looking down upon the entire world. Alexander's gaze looked toward the distance, as if staring at those lands he had conquered. Persia, Egypt. Caesar stood before the statue, gazing at it for a long time. Then he wept. Historical records say he shed tears before the statue. His friends looked at him in surprise and asked why he was crying. Caesar said, "At my age, Alexander had already conquered the entire world, and I have accomplished nothing." In that moment, he felt a deep sense of shame. He saw his own insignificance. He saw the passage of time. He saw those great names: Alexander, Hannibal, Scipio. They had left indelible marks on history, while he was just a minor official handling accounts in a border city. He wiped away his tears. He walked out of the temple. From that moment on, he knew he had to do something great. He had to make his name like Alexander's, remembered by future generations. 58 BC, spring, Gaul. At the foot of the Alps, Caesar standing before the legions. He had just been appointed governor of Gaul. This was an opportunity to escape the political struggles of Rome, an opportunity to establish military merit. But at this moment, what he faced was an exhausted army. The soldiers had just endured a grueling march. They had crossed the Alps, crossed the snow-covered passes. Their feet were covered with frostbite. Their armor was caked with mud. Their eyes were filled with exhaustion and doubt. They didn't know why they had come here. They didn't know why they should risk their lives for this newly arrived general. Caesar looked at them. He didn't immediately issue orders. He didn't immediately display his authority. Instead, he walked among the soldiers. He removed his general's cloak, revealing a simple military uniform. He stood before them and began to speak in a calm yet firm voice. "Soldiers," he said, "I know you are tired. I know you want to go home. I know you are asking, why are we here?" The soldiers listened in silence. "I'll tell you," Caesar continued. "We're here not for Rome's Senate, not for those nobles sitting in marble palaces. We're here for ourselves." His voice began to grow powerful. "In Gaul there are endless lands, endless riches, endless glory. If we conquer this place, every one of you will become wealthy. Every one of you will own land. Every one of you will be remembered by future generations." The soldiers began to raise their heads. "But more importantly," Caesar said, "we are here to prove that the Roman legions are the most powerful army in the world. We are here to let those barbarians know that wherever Rome's eagle standards reach, that is the boundary of civilization. He paused. "Follow me," he said, "and I will lead you to victory. I will lead you to glory. I will lead you to become legends." The soldiers erupted in cheers. In that moment, Caesar knew he had won their hearts. 52 BC, autumn. Alesia, a besieged city. On the city walls stood Vercingetorix, chieftain of the Gallic tribes, Caesar's most formidable enemy. He was young, brave, filled with a thirst for freedom. He had once united the various Gallic tribes and launched a rebellion against Rome. But now he had failed. Alesia had been besieged for months. The food in the city was exhausted. The people in the city were beginning to starve to death. The reinforcements Vercingetorix had sent out were defeated by Caesar. He knew there was no hope left. He made a decision. He opened the city gates and rode out alone on horseback. He wore his most magnificent armor, his horse adorned with golden ornaments, his sword hanging at his waist. He rode his horse, slowly approaching the Roman camp. Caesar, sitting on the high platform, waited for him. Vercingetorix arriving before the high platform, he dismounted, knelt on the ground. He removed his armor, placing it at Caesar's feet. He removed his sword, placing it at Caesar's feet. Then he raised his head, looking at Caesar, his eyes filled with pride and sorrow. He did not speak. He just knelt quietly, waiting for Caesar's judgment. Caesar looked at him. He did not speak immediately. He just quietly looked at this young enemy, this enemy who had once put him in a difficult position, this enemy who had almost defeated him. Then Caesar gave the order, "Imprison Vercingetorix." Vercingetorix was taken away by the soldiers. He was thrown into a cell, shackled in chains. He would spend 6 years there, 6 years of darkness, 6 years of waiting. Caesar would hold a triumph in Rome. On that day, Vercingetorix would be brought out of his cell, forced to walk behind Caesar's chariot, displayed to the people of Rome. Then, after the ceremony ended, he would be executed. But at this moment, beneath the walls of Alesia, Caesar just quietly watched as Vercingetorix was taken away. His face expressionless, his eyes unfathomable. 49 BC. Winter, the Rubicon River, flowing quietly. Caesar standing by the river. Behind him, his legions. Before him, the mainland of Rome. According to Roman law, he cannot lead his army across this river. If he crosses, he is a traitor. But if he doesn't cross, he will lose everything. The Senate has already ordered the removal of his military command. Pompey is ready to arrest him. If he lays down his arms and returns to Rome, he will face trial, face exile, even face execution. Caesar, gazing at the water, he remembers those years drowning in debt, those years weeping in Spain, those years campaigning in Gaul. He remembers those soldiers who followed him, those soldiers who bled for him. He remembers the statue of Alexander. He remembers his own oath. He will do something great. He will make his name remembered by posterity. He turns, looking at the soldiers. Then he speaks those famous words, "Alia, iacta, est." The die has been cast. He spurs his horse, crossing the Rubicon River, the soldiers following him. In that moment, the fate of the Roman Republic was rewritten. 44 BC, spring, the city of Rome, the Senate, Caesar sitting on his elevated seat. He is now the dictator of Rome, wielding supreme power. He conquered Gaul. He defeated Pompey. He quelled the civil war. His statues stand in the Forum. His name is carved on the temple walls. He achieved his dream. But at this moment, he feels a deep loneliness. He looks around at those senators. Their faces wear respectful smiles. But he knows that behind those smiles lie fear and hatred. They fear his power. They hate his ambition. They are waiting for an opportunity to get rid of him. Caesar knows all this. But he cannot stop. He has gone too far. He has crossed too many lines. He has carried too much blood on his hands. He thinks of Vercingetorix, that young man who knelt at Alesia. He thinks of those soldiers who died on the battlefields of Gaul. He thinks of those Romans who fell in the civil war. He knows his hands are stained with blood. But he also knows he has no other choice. Because if he gives up power, he will lose everything. He will be tried, exiled, forgotten. So he keeps moving forward. He keeps ruling. He keeps conquering. Until one day in this Senate, 23 daggers pierce his body. But that is a story for later. At this moment, in the spring of 44 BC, Caesar still sat in his seat, overlooking Rome. His brilliance illuminated the entire empire. But behind that brilliance was a deep shadow. That shadow was his ambition. That shadow was his loneliness. That shadow was the price he paid for power. Caesar was one of the greatest figures in Roman history. His military talent was unmatched. His political wisdom was admirable. His reforms laid the foundation for the Roman Empire. But Caesar was also a controversial figure. He destroyed the Republic. He pioneered dictatorship. His conquests brought countless deaths. Historians still debate to this day, was Caesar a hero or a tyrant? But perhaps this question itself is wrong, because Caesar was both a hero and a tyrant. He was a complex man, a man full of ambition, talent, cruelty, and loneliness. He was Rome's brilliance. He was also Rome's shadow. But Caesar was not all of Rome. Behind his brilliance was the blood of countless nameless soldiers. Behind his victories was the heavy price of imperial expansion. And those prices were slowly eroding Rome's foundation. 54 BC, early autumn. Rome, Crassus's residence. Candlelight flickered on the marble walls. The long table was laden with wine and fruit. But Crassus had no mind to enjoy these. He stood by the window, gazing into the distance. He was 61 years old. He was the richest man in Rome, owning countless lands, mines, and slaves. His wealth was enough to buy the entire city of Rome. But he was not satisfied, because he saw Caesar, that young man who once borrowed money from him, now building his achievements in Gaul. He saw Pompey, that former ally, now bearing the title, the Great. And he, Crassus, was just a rich man. History books would not record the names of the rich. History books would only record the names of conquerors. So, Crassus made a decision. He would wage a war. He would conquer the East. He would conquer Parthia, that mysterious empire on the Persian plateau. Parthia, prosperous and distant. There was silk, there were spices, there was gold. The caravans there connected Rome with the distant East, that place called the Land of Silk. Conquering Parthia meant controlling the eastern trade routes, meant obtaining endless wealth. More importantly, conquering Parthia meant surpassing Alexander, because Alexander had once conquered Persia, and Crassus would conquer Persia's successor. His friends advised him not to go. They said, Parthia is too far away. They said, Parthia's cavalry is too powerful. They said, you are already over 60 years old. You shouldn't take risks anymore. But Crassus wouldn't listen. In his eyes, there was only glory. In his heart, there was only ambition. In 53 BC, spring, Crassus led 7 legions, more than 40,000 soldiers, left Rome and marched eastward. It was a massive army. It was an army full of confidence. But it was also an army about to march toward destruction. In 53 BC summer, Mesopotamia, near Carrhae, the sun hung in the sky like a burning fireball. The desert stretched endlessly. The Roman legions marched through the desert. The soldiers' armor glinted blindingly in the sunlight. Their footsteps left deep marks in the sand. Their throats were so parched they felt like cracking. Crassus sat on his horse, looking ahead. His guide, an Arab chieftain named Ariamnes, told him, this road is a shortcut to the Parthian capital. As long as they cross this desert, they can directly attack the enemy's heart. Crassus believed him. But what he didn't know was, Ariamnes was a Parthian spy. What he didn't know was, this road was a trap. The legions continued forward, the desert getting hotter and hotter, the soldiers starting to feel exhausted, their water pouches already empty, their lips starting to crack, their eyes starting to become dull. But Crassus ordered them to keep moving forward, because he believed, as long as they crossed this desert, victory would be ahead. Then, one afternoon on the horizon, a cloud of dust appeared. That dust getting closer and closer, that dust getting bigger and bigger. Then the soldiers saw it was cavalry, thousands upon thousands of cavalry. Parthian cavalry they came, like the wind, like a sandstorm. Parthian cavalry, not like Roman cavalry. They didn't wear heavy armor, didn't carry long spears. They rode swift horses, wielding composite bows. Their tactics, not charging but circling, they surrounded the Roman legions, keeping their distance. Then they started shooting arrows, arrows falling like rain, dense, merciless, deadly rain of arrows. Roman soldiers raised their shields, trying to block. But there were too many arrows. Arrows pierced through shields, pierced through armor, pierced through flesh and blood. Soldiers started falling, one after another, their screams echoing through the desert, their blood seeping into the sand, their bodies collapsing under the scorching sun, soon dried into mummies. Crassus ordered the legion to form a testudo formation. Soldiers raised their shields above their heads. creating an impenetrable defensive formation. But it was useless, because the Parthians had a special type of cavalry, cataphracts. They wore heavy iron armor and rode tall war horses. They wielded long spears, and like iron hammers they smashed into the Roman formation. The testudo formation began to collapse. The soldiers began to flee. But they had nowhere to run, because all around was desert. All around were enemies. Crassus looked at the battlefield. His heart was sinking. He knew he had made a mistake. He shouldn't have come here. He shouldn't have trusted that guide. He shouldn't have led the legion into this desert. But now it was too late. His son, Publius Crassus, rode up to him on horseback. Publius was young and brave. He had once followed Caesar in battle in Gaul, earning great military achievements. Now he requested of his father, let him lead the cavalry to charge the enemy lines. Crassus hesitated, but seeing his son's determined eyes, he finally nodded. Publius led 1,300 cavalrymen and charged toward the Parthians. They charged very fast. They charged very bravely. But they never came back. The Parthians lured them to a more distant place, then surrounded them, then killed them all. Publius fought until the very last moment. When his horse fell, he still stood, swinging his sword. When all his soldiers fell, he still stood, facing the enemy. Finally, an arrow pierced through his throat. He fell. The Parthians cut off his head. Then they mounted that head on a spear and rode back to the battlefield. Crassus saw that head. It was his son's head. In that moment, his world collapsed. The battle lasted the entire day. When night fell, the Roman legions had already lost more than half their men. The sandy ground was covered with corpses everywhere, blood everywhere, shattered shields and broken spears everywhere. Crassus ordered a retreat. But retreating was even harder than fighting, because the Parthians were still pursuing. Like a pack of wolves, they followed the Roman legions closely, constantly attacking, constantly shooting arrows. The soldiers fled in the darkness. They abandoned their armor, abandoned their weapons, abandoned everything heavy. They just wanted to survive. But many didn't survive. They got lost in the darkness. They died of thirst in the desert. They fell under the enemy's arrows. In the end, fewer than 10,000 men escaped back to Roman territory. More than 40,000 soldiers died at Carrhae. The eagle standard, symbol of the Roman legion, mark of Roman glory, fell into enemy hands. This was one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. This was the limit of the Roman Empire's expansion. Crassus did not escape back to Rome. During the retreat, the Parthians sent envoys to see him, saying they were willing to negotiate. Crassus, exhausted and desperate, agreed. He rode on horseback to the Parthian camp. But it wasn't a negotiation, it was a trap. When Crassus arrived, the Parthians suddenly launched an attack. In the chaos, Crassus was killed. There are many legends about his death. Some say the Parthians cut off his head and sent it to their king. Some say the Parthians poured molten gold into his mouth to mock his greed for wealth. Whatever the truth, Crassus's end was tragic. He pursued glory, but all he got was death. He pursued conquest, but all he left behind was disgrace. His name was not remembered by later generations as a great conqueror like Alexander. Instead, his name became synonymous with failure. But Crassus was not the only victim. The real victims were those soldiers who followed him into the desert, those soldiers who fell under the rain of arrows, those soldiers who got lost in the darkness, those soldiers who were captured. In the history books, the name of Crassus was recorded. In the history books, the date of the Battle of Carrhae was recorded. But in the history books, the names of those soldiers were not recorded. Who were they? Where did they come from? Did they have families? Did they have dreams? No one knows, because they were just the price of imperial expansion. They were just a grain of sand in the long river of history. After the war, about 10,000 Roman soldiers were captured by the Parthians. They were taken to the distant east. Legend says they were sent to the borders of the Parthian Empire, forced to guard the frontiers for the Parthians. Legend says they continued eastward, crossed the desert, crossed the mountains, and finally reached a distant land. The place called the Land of Silk. That land was the Han Dynasty. Chinese historical records state, on the western border of the Han Dynasty, a strange army once appeared. They used a special formation, the fish scale formation, which was very similar to the Roman testudo formation. Some scholars believe those soldiers were the survivors of the Battle of Carrhae. In the distant east, they established a small settlement. They married and had children, multiplied their descendants. Their bloodline merged into that land. But this is just a legend. The truth can no longer be verified. The only thing certain is, those soldiers never returned to Rome. Their families never saw them again. Their names were forgotten by history. The Battle of Carrhae marked the limit of Roman expansion. Rome was a powerful empire. Its legions conquered all lands along the Mediterranean coast. Its eagle standards flew over Europe, Africa, and Asia. But Rome was not invincible. In the east, there was Parthia. In the north, there were Germanic tribes. In the west, there was the Atlantic Ocean. Rome's expansion encountered geographical limitations, enemy resistance, and its own exhaustion. Every conquest required soldiers, every conquest required money, every conquest required blood, and Rome had already paid too much. During the same period in the distant east, another empire was also expanding. That was the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty was as powerful as Rome. Its territory stretched from the East Sea to the western regions. Its army defeated the Xiongnu and controlled the Silk Road. But the Han Dynasty's expansion also came at a tremendous cost. Emperor Wu of Han, in order to fight the Xiongnu, mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops. He levied heavy taxes and depleted the treasury. His campaigns lasted for decades, leading to the deaths of countless soldiers and the destruction of countless families. In Emperor Wu's later years, he began to reflect. He issued an edict of self-blame, admitting his mistakes and acknowledging that his campaigns had brought suffering to the people. He said, "Since I ascended the throne, my actions have been reckless and misguided, causing the world to suffer in sorrow which cannot be undone." This is an emperor's confession of his own ambition. This is an empire's reflection on the cost of expansion. Rome had no such reflection. Rome's emperors continued to wage war. Rome's legions continued to advance. Until one day, the foundation of the empire began to shake. 44 BC, spring, Rome beneath the triumphal arch. Caesar stood on his chariot, receiving the cheers of the people. He conquered Gaul. He defeated Pompey. He quelled the civil war. He was Rome's dictator, Rome's hero. The people cheered for him. The people showered him with flowers. The people shouted his name, but Caesar, watching all this, felt a deep emptiness in his heart. He remembered those battlefields. He remembered those soldiers who died. He remembered the villages of Gaul burned down. He remembered the people of Gaul, slaughtered. He remembered Vercingetorix kneeling before him. He won the victory, but that victory was bought with countless lives. That victory was watered with countless blood. Was that victory really worth it? Caesar had no answer. He just stood quietly on his chariot, watching the cheering crowd, feeling that emptiness, that exhaustion, that unspeakable heaviness. The expansion of an empire always comes with a price. That price is the lives of soldiers. That price is the shattering of families. That price is the suffering of the people. Rome, for expansion, paid countless prices. The Han Dynasty, for expansion, paid countless prices. All empires are like this. In history books, those glorious victories are recorded. In history books, those great conquerors are recorded, but in history books, those prices are rarely recorded. Rarely recorded are those soldiers who fell in the desert. Rarely recorded are those mothers who wept on the battlefield. Rarely recorded are those forgotten names, but those prices are real. Those prices are heavy. Those prices are the eternal shadow behind the glory of empires. 476 AD autumn, Rome an empty square. Wind blows through the broken stone pillars. Once, this was the heart of the empire. Here was the Senate, the triumphal arches, the temples. Here were countless statues, countless inscriptions, countless glories. But now only ruins remain here. The stone pillars have collapsed. The statues have shattered. The inscriptions have faded. The Western Roman Empire has fallen. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. A Germanic barbarian chieftain occupied the city of Rome. The imperial eagle standards no longer flew. 1,000 years of glory just like that came to an end. But in those ruins there are still echoes. That is the sound of the legions marching. That is the soldiers' battle cries. That is the sound of eagle standards fluttering in the wind. Those sounds, crossing through time, crossing through space, still gently reverberate across this land. On the outskirts of the city of Rome, there stands an ancient monument. That is Trajan's Column, built to commemorate Emperor Trajan's conquest of Dacia. The stone column towers into the clouds, carved with exquisite reliefs. Those reliefs tell the story of war, soldiers crossing the Danube, attacking enemy fortresses, capturing enemy leaders. Every detail is carved so vividly. The soldier's armor, clearly visible. The soldier's expressions, lifelike and realistic. As if they're still alive. As if they're still fighting, but they've long since turned to dust. Those soldiers, those generals, those emperors, their names are carved on the stone column, but their bodies have long since decayed. Their souls have long since dissipated. Only these stone columns still stand. Only these carvings still speak. They are witnesses to history. They are the carriers of memory. They remind future generations. Once there was a great empire that existed on this land. The Roman legions disappeared, but its legacy still remains. Its tactics influenced military thought in later generations. Its organization became the prototype of modern armies. Its spirit inspired countless generals and soldiers. In the Middle Ages, European knights studied the tactics of the Roman legions. During the Renaissance, military theorists translated Roman military texts. In modern times, Napoleon and Prussian generals drew inspiration from the Roman legions. The Roman legions' phalanx evolved into modern infantry formations. The Roman legions' centurions evolved into the modern officer system. The Roman legions' discipline evolved into modern military training methods. Even today, when we talk about military organization, when we talk about tactical discipline, we can still see the shadow of the Roman legions, that shadow faint and blurry, but still there. Caesar, though assassinated, his reforms laid the foundation for the Roman Empire. He reformed the structure of the legions, making soldiers more loyal to their generals rather than the Senate. He reformed provincial administration, making the empire's rule more efficient. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar. That calendar is still in use today. More importantly, he set a precedent. A powerful individual could override the republican system. His adopted son, Octavian, inherited his legacy and became Rome's first emperor. Augustus. From then on, Rome was no longer a republic. Rome became an empire. This empire lasted 500 years. This empire ruled the Mediterranean world. This empire shaped the foundation of Western civilization. And all of this began with Caesar. Began with that man who cast the die at the Rubicon River, but behind those great names are countless forgotten names. Those soldiers who fell on the battlefields of Gaul, what were their names? Those soldiers who died of thirst in the Kara Desert, where did they come from? Those soldiers who were captured and exiled to the distant east, are their families still waiting for them to return? History remembered Caesar. History remembered Pompey. History remembered Crassus. But history forgot those ordinary soldiers. They have no statues. They have no monuments. They have no historical records. They were just a cog, a screw in the imperial machine. When they fell, the empire would find new cogs, new screws, and keep running. But they were also human. They also had dreams. They also had families. They also had fears and hopes. It is just that no one remembers. The fall of the Roman Empire left many lessons for future generations. An empire, no matter how powerful, will decline. A legion, no matter how brave, will fail. A civilization, no matter how glorious, will turn to dust. But why? Why did Rome fall? Historians have given many answers. Some say it was because of barbarian invasions. Some say it was because of economic collapse. Some say it was because of moral decay. Some say it was because of the rise of Christianity. Perhaps all these reasons are correct. Perhaps the fall of Rome was not due to one single reason, but the accumulation of countless reasons. Like an ancient building, it doesn't collapse because of one brick falling off, but because countless bricks loosen, ultimately leading to the collapse of the entire structure. Rome was the same. Its expansion exhausted its resources. Its conquests created countless enemies. Its slavery planted the seeds of social conflict. Its corruption eroded its foundation. In the end, when those barbarians arrived at the city gates, Rome no longer had the strength to resist. Not because the barbarians were too powerful, but because Rome was too exhausted. Night fell. The city of Rome was plunged into darkness. Moonlight spilled over those broken stone pillars. Wind blew across the empty plaza. If you listen carefully, you'll hear some sounds. That is the sound of soldiers' footsteps, echoing on the stone-paved roads. That is the sound of hoofbeats, coming from distant valleys. That is the sound of eagle standards, fluttering in the wind. Those sounds are faint, soft, like whispers in a dream. They tell of years that have already passed. They tell of stories that have already been forgotten. They tell of glory, of sorrow, of a past that can never be changed. History is like a river. It flows endlessly from the past toward the future. Rome is just one stretch of this river. It was once magnificent, once majestic, but in the end it too flowed into the sea, disappearing into endless waters. Before Rome there was Greece, there was Persia, there was Egypt. After Rome there was Byzantium, there was Arabia, there was Mongolia. Every civilization was once glorious, every empire was once powerful. But in the end, they all turned to dust. Only time still flows on. Only history continues to extend. We stand on the banks of this river, watching those civilizations that have passed away, watching those empires that have vanished. We see their glory. We also see their tragedy. We learn from them. We reflect upon them. We try to understand what is eternal, what is fleeting, what is worth pursuing, what should be avoided. The Roman legions left us with an eternal question. What does power mean? What does conquest mean? What does glory mean? The Roman legions possessed tremendous power. They conquered most of the known world. They achieved supreme glory. But in the end, that power dissipated. That conquest was forgotten. That glory turned to dust. So does all of this have meaning? Perhaps the meaning lies not in the outcome, but in the process. Not in whether the empire endures forever, but in whether those soldiers fought bravely. Not in whether names are remembered, but in whether those people truly lived. The soldiers of the Roman legions, they lived. They loved, hated, feared, hoped. They bled on the battlefield, laughed in the camps, tilled the fields of their homeland. They were real people. Their lives were real lives. Even if their names are forgotten, even if their stories are buried, they still existed. And this, perhaps, is where the meaning lies. The night grows deeper and deeper. The moon slowly rises, illuminating those ancient ruins. In the ruins there is an owl standing quietly on a stone pillar, its eyes bright and profound. As if gazing at the river of time, it saw the rise of Rome. It saw the fall of Rome. It saw those soldiers, those generals, those emperors. It saw their glory, and also saw their tragedy. Then it spreads its wings and flies toward the night sky. Its silhouette disappears into the darkness, leaving only those ruins standing quietly, leaving only those stone pillars telling their stories quietly, leaving only those memories echoing quietly. Dear traveler, our journey is coming to an end. Together we've walked through the history of Rome. We saw the birth of the legions, saw their brilliance, and also saw their decline. We saw those great names, Caesar, Pompey, Crassus. We also saw those forgotten names, those ordinary soldiers, those nameless heroes. Now the night is already very deep. It is time to let these stories sink into slumber. It is time to let these memories turn into dreams. Close your eyes. Let those ancient voices echo in your dreams. Let those distant scenes emerge in your mind. You will see the Roman plaza awakening in the morning light, the legion's soldiers training in the camp, the eagle standard fluttering in the wind, Caesar standing by the Rubicon River, Crassus falling in the desert, those scenes growing more and more blurred, those voices growing more and more distant. In the end, everything returns to stillness, returns to darkness, returns to the depths of dreams. History is like this. It was once earth-shattering, once magnificent and turbulent, but in the end everything will return to calm. Rome's legions disappeared, Rome's empire fell, Rome's glory turned to dust. But that dust didn't truly vanish. It scattered in the wind, fell upon the earth, merged into the soil. From that soil, new civilizations grew. From those civilizations, new stories were born. History cycles like this over and over. One era ends, another era begins. One empire falls, another empire rises. But in that cycle there are some things that are eternal. That is human nature. That is dreams. That is the pursuit of glory, the yearning for freedom, the love of life. These things, transcending time, transcending space, still exist in our hearts. Now, let us stay here quietly for a moment. Let us feel those ancient breaths in these ruins. Let us listen to those distant voices in this darkness. The Roman legions have long gone, but their spirit still remains. It reminds us courage is precious, discipline is important, but more importantly, remember, behind every glory there is a price. Behind every victory there is sacrifice. Behind every empire there are countless ordinary people's lives. Don't forget those prices. Don't forget those sacrifices. Don't forget those lives, because only by remembering can we truly understand history. Only by understanding can we avoid repeating the same mistakes. Only by avoiding can we create a better future. All right, dear traveler, our story is finished. Rome's legions have already sunk into the long river of history. Those soldiers have already turned to dust. Those names have already been scattered by the wind. But their stories are still here, still in these words, still in your memory. Now, let these stories accompany you to sleep. Let those ancient voices become your lullaby. Let those distant scenes become your dreams. May you, in your dreams, see the glory of Rome. May you, in your dreams, hear the footsteps of the legions. May you, in your dreams, feel the warmth of history. Then, in that gentle dream, fall peacefully asleep. Good night, traveler. Good night, Rome. Good night, those years that have already passed. May the dust settle. May all be well.